Excellent. I cannot think of a better way to kick off this session. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, and welcome everyone to Africa Liberty Forum. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are joining us from. We're very excited for this session. What is the roadmap for African prosperity? We are here with the founder and editor of Libre Afrique and an excellent guitarist, Emmanuel Martin, as well as the director for the Atlas Network Center for African Prosperity, Magatte Wade. And we have with us the ecosystem builder and entrepreneur, Emeka Okafor. We're very excited for this conversation, and I'll hand it off to Magatte to kick things off.
Well, thank you so much, Hunter, and thanks so much, Emmanuel, as well. It was so beautiful. I love music so much. Yeah, so I'm very excited for today. Thank you to all of you guys for being here today, and I can't wait for this, conversation because I think everyone in this room is a big fan of Africa, right? We all believe that we will see a prosperous Africa in our lifetime. And the reason why this panel is because we're going to have two people who really can speak to it. And without any further ado, let's get going with Emmanuel first. Then we're going to have Emeka, and then we'll go into the conversation. And as quickly as possible after that, we'll go into questions. So we're trying to make it as interactive as possible. So while people are speaking and questions are coming to your mind, make sure you put them in the chat box. We'll try to address as many of them as possible in the third phase of this. So Emmanuel, without further ado, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Magatte, and thank you, Atlas, for organizing this beautiful event online. I just want to mention that the translation of Applied Economics for Africa by Georges Aïté, the translation to French, the French version is actually in the chat. If you look in the chat, there's a PDF. There's also another book I will mention later in French. This session is about Georges Aïté, and George had a vision of development that really borrowed from institutional economics, Austrian economics, and public choice theory. He had a very clear idea of what we economists call the two pillars of economic science, namely the problem of knowledge and the problem of incentives, and apply them to development economics for Africa. If you want to understand incentives and knowledge issues, it's very easy. If you want people to prosper together, that's what economic development is about. They must exchange. You have to have trade, exchange in order to create value and generate services for others and all that. That's the basic logic of comparative advantage. And that's the basic logic of peaceful cooperation based, of course, on exchange, which is a positive sum game. Thus, you need to have some sort of coordination in a decentralized way. You don't have, Stalin or Hitler or whoever to coordinate this. People coordinate amongst themselves. So it's a decentralized coordination. And in order to have that, you precisely need to solve two problems: the problem of incentives. Do people have the incentive to coordinate and cooperate with others? And this requires a legal framework that sort of sets the rules, providing the right incentives for productive cooperation rather than plunder, violence, and passivity and all that. And when we talk about development, entrepreneurs are absolutely crucial, especially small entrepreneurs, and they need the right incentives. They need the good incentives to set up and develop businesses, which are the center of development. And Georges Aïté really described how too often the rules, the legal framework, the rules that are made by politics in Africa actually destroy the incentives to exchange, to produce, not only because of legislation that's derived from collectivist ideologies borrowed from abroad, I will come back to this, but also because of the corruption that we find. And the second problem is the problem of knowledge. How do we know what to produce for others? How do we know how to create value? How do we know how to render services for others? Well, this is problematic. So how do we know what is available for production needs and all that sort of issues? how can each of us have an idea of the needs and possibilities of others, and therefore the various scarcities, if you want, of things? This is a crucial question in a world where people who exchange with one another actually don't know one another. So you have this problem of knowledge, and decentralized coordination relies in a very substantial way on market prices. Prices, they convey information. They convey information about relative scarcities. And in his book, Applied Economics for Africa, which is, again, available in French in the chat, George Ayittey analyzed a whole series of examples in Africa where he dealt with numerous government price controls. And those price controls, they actually block the information that is necessary for coordination of economic activities. So George's development theory really was based on those two pillars, the incentive problem and the knowledge problem. And here I would like to recall only three ideas in his theory of development and referring to incentives and knowledge problems in each case. The first idea is that development is essentially a bottom-up process. It comes from the bottom, it comes from us. George was very critical of top-down development strategies based on state-led industrialization, for instance. Why? Because incentives. What incentives do planners have, central planners have? You know, central planners are just bureaucrats. They don't have a skin in the game. So the chances are very high that they're going to make bad decisions. Similarly, these top-down development strategies run up against the same knowledge problem as in socialist countries in which you have central planning, The planners simply do not have the necessary knowledge of the needs, of the opportunities, of the scarcities, because it's a centralized system. So all those top-down strategies for development have systematically led to economic disaster and wastage, unfortunately, from Ghana to Algeria to Ethiopia, name it. And this is why Ayittey actually defended his vision of an Africa of cheetahs, versus hippos. The hippos were the cheetahs, were the entrepreneurs, the African entrepreneurs, the dynamic African civil society that generates development. And the hippos were the old bureaucrats, if you want, with their old-fashioned top-down development strategies. The cheetahs, they both have the right incentives and the on-the-ground knowledge of how to find solutions, entrepreneurial solutions to Africans' problems, and thus create development at the same time. The second idea that I really like in George's heritage, if you want, is that aid does not aid. International aid, development aid does not really work. So no wonder, after what we said before, no wonder George was also very critical of development aid. Just like Dambisa Moyo or William Easterly, he showed that aid creates bad incentives. We go back to the theme of incentives again, both for members of recipient governments, but also for aid agencies and donor countries. Why? Because aid is a source of corruption on both sides of the aid corridor, if you want. And probably more importantly, the fact that when you have aid, it prevents the rule of law, because the government that receives aid, the African government that receives aid, is no longer accountable to its people, to the people of the country, but to an agency in Washington or Brussels or what. So it's really bad for the rule of law, because accountability disappears. That's a huge issue. And then on the problem of knowledge, how do aid agency strategists, how do they know the needs and possibilities of local populations? You have experts flying out from Washington and spend 2 days in Grand-Bassam or Abidjan, and they're supposed to have the knowledge of the local problems. That's just ridiculous, okay? That's a knowledge problem again. The third idea I would like to mention here is that what we call institutional transplants, they are complicated. Institutional transplants is when you do a copy paste of institutions that worked abroad and you copy paste them in your country. George was very critical of these transplants, especially socialist institutional transplants, obviously. He was actually shocked by the idea that African society was traditionally socialist. He was very critical of that. He thought that maybe this came from a confusion by the colonizers who had mistaken extended family property as a form of socialist collectivism. George really pointed out that private property and family ownership are actually central to traditional Africa. And for him, socialism was a non-African ideology. It was an institutional transplant, again, that was imported from the West and elsewhere, and which actually does not correspond to the African tradition. The Ujamaa in Tanzania is not African at all, if you want. It's just like some form of USSR with an African decorum. So George's reflections on the cheetahs in economic matters are very much consistent with his insistence on African solutions to African problems. Africa must rediscover its own institutional tradition, its own institutional roots in order to find a path to economic development. And that's why he was also cautious of what we would call democracy from above, which is democracy reduced to national elections imposed by international organizations, which has very often led to ethnic struggles for the monopolization of power, of central power. And to some extent, George favored a kind of traditional African deliberative democracy based on subsidiarity, which therefore begins in the village and not in the capital. Again, it's a bottom-up process. It's a bottom-up democratic process. And this is very important because people on the ground at the bottom, they also have the knowledge of their own political issues they have to solve together. And sometimes expert in institutions that come from Paris or Washington, they don't have the knowledge to lead institutional change. Yes, we want to change institutions in Africa in order to make it more, in order for it to have a better performances. But this institutional change should come from within. And that's the whole challenge of our discussion. And that's the whole challenge that George actually presented in his books. I'm sure we'll have time in the discussion to dig deeper into this. These are only three aspects of George's thought, of course, which is very rich, but I leave it there. And thank you. I've already spoken too much. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. And I have to say that for me, it's a very emotional time to be talking about George, given that only a few months ago. It's still hard to process that he's gone. I think we have no idea how just a critical and independent thinker he was. For someone like him to go dig where he was digging. In his time, when everybody else was going south, he was heading north. It takes a tremendous person to kind of look at where he looked at. And I think he left us with such humongous treasures for the rest of us to keep exploring. And I do think that like George taught us, Nyerere, with his whole essay on Ubuntu, really did not do us a good service. And, this whole concept of Ubuntu is mixed up with the concept of Africans being collectivist/socialist. It was not very helpful for any of us. And I'm hoping that maybe the word of Kenyatta is gonna, as we start looking into it, it's gonna change that perspective. But anyway, yeah, I'm so happy that we're having this session and it's focused on George. And talking of which, Emeka Okafor is the person who personally I owe my discovery of George to. He's the one who invited George to speak at TED Africa in Arusha for the first time in 2007. And I will never forget, because that totally changed my life. The reason why I'm even with you here and even espousing these ideas is because of that specific time I had at TED in Arusha in 2007. And Emeka is the one who brought George there. I saw that today Emeka just published a tribute for our beloved professor. I just put it onto the chat box. I would encourage you to read it. It's beautiful, and it's over at TED, and yeah, at least for him. But all of us have to carry on with his legacy. You know, he was able to see things that no one else could see in his time, and for that alone, it's just fantastic. So, Emeka, I'm going to have you talk to us now. I know that you are so big on the need for Africa to industrialize, and you're also very outspoken on this theory of complex economics. So Emeka, please go on. And again, thank you for bringing George to my radar and giving me.
Thanks, Maguette. Am I audible? Okay. Yeah, so George in many ways for me was a mentor and a friend. And when I say a mentor, he was almost a mental mentor, because prior to me meeting him, there was this sense of confusion or misunderstanding that I had about how where the continent was, what its options were, and where it could go. And it was only when I started reading his books that things began to form in my mind on what was not working, how it could work better, and what the possibilities were from a very sort of internal, intrinsic standpoint. So I am not an economist, but I can say that there are a number of areas that I would sort of distill from George's thinking that I think are intrinsic to the roadmap that he laid out for us, or the roadmap that he laid out for those of us who are trying to ponder the relative lack of success the continent has vis-a-vis other parts of the world that have faced similar challenges. And by no means are these areas or points that I came up with, but to a large extent, I think that George, in some ways, even though he's passed on, at least for me, helped synthesize these various areas, which Emmanuel sort of spoke to, but I would add to the general picture. And one of the points that Emmanuel brought up was the need for things to, for politics or democracy or whatever you choose to call it, to be bottom up. And for us to have an operating bottom up polity that will drive the types of areas that a society needs to be productive, you need various classes to emerge, classes of people who think in a certain way, who operate in a particular way. And one of the areas that I see as almost key to that, and George spoke to this in many conversations we had, was the need to have a productive class, an entrepreneurial class. And if a society doesn't have a class that is based, or a grouping that is based on production and the idea that they create wealth, the politics isn't going to work, because the politics up until that point is going to be based on people who derive their presence from what some would call consumption. And what we've seen across the continent is great consumption, and this conflation of what consumption is with a middle class, but you have a middle class that doesn't necessarily produce things. And till we have a group of people in any society, in any African countries that really base their modus operandi on production, we're going to falter, because all you're going to have, and this is something George spoke to, all you're going to have is people who are seeking power, but when they get into power, they don't have the tools to generate the wealth to make their societies prosperous. And that is lacking, and this is something he spoke to. And I think when we look at the dragons that need to be slayed here, another one is the idea that because we have fast-growing populations, that for some strange reason, that means growth. No, but if you have growth without prosperity, if you have growth without an entrepreneurial or productive class, you're actually staring at the abyss. And I think that once again, absence of production that will come from an entrepreneurial class, which is at the foundation, plays into the lack of success that we're seeing. And George was also one for looking within, indigenuity, which is something Manuel spoke to. Yes, we have the Asian example on what happened in terms of how they grew. But once again, we have to figure out a way to what the type of export-led growth or growth that is along similar lines to build our societies and build wealth in a particular way. But you're not going to get export-led growth if you don't add value. And the only way you truly add value in a variety of ways is via industrialization. And what does that mean ultimately? Well, if we're going to have a society or societies or countries that have a plethora of complex items they produce, bringing up the theory of economic complexity, we won't be able to do that if we're not industrialized. So these various tenets of economic complexity, industrialization, export-led growth, growth with prosperity that is based on an entrepreneurial productive class, in so many ways are tied into his thinking. And we can tease this apart further on in the conversation, but these are, in my view, the points or the foundational aspects we need to look at if we're going to have the type of emergence and growth that we hope to see in Africa. So I'll stop there. My 5 to 6 minutes is up, but I just wanted to speak to that briefly. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Emeka. So when I listened to what Emmanuel said, and I listened to what Emeka said, Emeka truly wants to get us to an industrialized state of affairs. And Emmanuel is talking about how George was talking about how we do that. I guess my question for you guys, and maybe for everybody here too, is how can we move in the direction that Emeka is advocating for, the results he wants us to get to, in a line, with Professor Ayite's technique as described by Emmanuel? Is it even possible? That's a question that I would push back on you guys.
Yeah. That was the challenge of reform. And in chapter 8 of the book, he says, how can we deal with reform? And actually, it starts with intellectual freedom. For George, the first reform to make was to have intellectual freedom. And then they could be followed by political reform, constitutional reform, institutional reform in the parliament and all that. And then economic liberalization. Economic liberalization would come last, which was, for a lot of people, would be surprising. But I thought this was interesting. Of course, the fight against corruption is a big chunk of his work. How can we fight against corruption in Africa? But again, he thinks that civil society has a role to play in that, and that's why intellectual freedom is very important. We have to change the minds of the people so that they will exert pressure on politicians and organizations. The strength of educated civil society is actually a very important thing in this transition, in this institutional change process.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Emeka, I see you raising your hand.
Yes, thanks, Emmanuel, for that. I think one of the things that I've been pondering for a while is that I remember, it might have been in 2003, which seems like eons ago, I blogged this post about the lack of a productive society across Africa. And I was speaking to the fact that something that was fundamental, unsexy, was absent from the major discourse around how we become a society of producers and makers. This was in 2004. And we're in 2002, right? So we're talking about 22 years ago. It sort of is scary to think about it. And the conversation I see at the highest levels when it comes to policy in Africa is only beginning to sort of, in smidgens, acknowledge the fact that if we are to sit at the table with everybody else and not on the kids' table, we have to be able to produce things. I think it was most stark when COVID hit, and the continent was essentially completely absolutely dependent on others to deal with what was one of the most critical health emergencies in 5, 6, 10 generations. And I don't think there's anything more important or more important than the fact that, not to say that we have to become a Japan, or an African country can become a Japan in 50 to 70 years, or a Bangladesh, or even a Pakistan, but the fact that there's nothing less important than the fact that we have to become a country of producers, because that's when you sort of hold the destiny in your hands. So there are countries like possibly Ethiopia, and George might quibble with them because their approach was more top-down. And then you have countries that maybe in West Africa may have a more bottom-up approach. I don't think we need to be ideological about the exact methods to employ in building industries in a whole swathe of sectors, because countries are also culturally different. But in every which way, whether it's a country like Kenya that has a vibrant agricultural sector, or it's some of the Southern African countries that have this sort of emphasis on the metallurgical industries, or it's Morocco, which is quite close to Europe and has become an offshoring center for a lot of advanced manufacturing. It's so critical that each country, each group, each society determines within itself a path that speaks to what their inherent strengths are. Because if we look at Europe or the United States, what Switzerland does in terms of high precision machinery is not necessarily what you're going to find in Denmark, or you're going to find in Taiwan. So I think countries need to carve a path, but this should be their #1 priority. And it should be a #1 priority that's in their interest. Because one of the things that is beginning to happen, and it irks a number of people, is that there is a constituency outside Africa that tries to push the narrative that, no, this isn't something you should be focusing on. You should be focusing on industrialization that doesn't hurt the environment. That's fine and well, right? But we need to be in a position where we have the resources to make that determination ourselves and not have others dictate it to us. Because ultimately, when the cookie crumbles, so to speak, countries ultimately make decisions in their own best interest. And we're seeing it unfold today with the war in Ukraine. All of a sudden, Europe is tossing out all its thinking around the fuels they should use. And the idea that coal shouldn't be used is not something that matters when you're thinking of whether you're going to freeze during the winter. But meanwhile, we have institutions that will not lend resources or funding to African countries to use the cheapest form of energy that they would need to industrialize, simply because countries that industrialized for 100, 200 years, that contributed more to where we are from a climate change perspective, felt that, well, it's not up to them to, it's up to them to decide how we develop. So I think there needs to be a lot more agency in the idea of what is in our own interest than is the case today. And we shouldn't allow others to dictate that. And that's why wealth creation is important, because if you have the wealth that is generated from production, you're not going to be dictated by others. But up until this point, we are allowing others to dictate what our development should be, and we're paying the price. So I think in summary, I'll say that the path will not be the same for everyone. We should look at our inherent strengths. We should look at what matters to us from a standpoint of what's in our own best interest. And we should develop paths that are very fine-tuned to build on what our advantages are. So I'll stop there, but those are some of my additional thoughts.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emeka. Emmanuel, did you want to add anything to that before we try to go into the questions? Or
yeah, I would like to add just to mention the book by Matt Warner that is at the top of the chat, and which I translated into French, Poverty and Freedom, Pauvreté et Liberté. It's a very important book, especially the first part of it, because it exactly deals with what Emeka was saying before. We all have different countries with different traditions, with different cultures, with different background and opportunities and all that. And which means that the best people to know what is the best solution for the country is the people inside the country. And the book is about this, is about how local think tanks and local civil society, but obviously local intellectuals in local think tanks, they're in the best position to know what is to be done in the country because they have the local knowledge. So I think the two books actually go very fit nicely together. And for those who arrived late, you have the book Applied Economics for Africa in French, and at the top of the chat you have the PDF.
Great, thank you.
By Georges Aïté.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So please, everybody, get your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. But we want to make sure these are questions. We're not looking for, statements. Please, guys. I'm seeing a question here. Just a quick question. Is there a need to revisit the African democracy based on its dynamics currently? And I saw that Rejoice did, no, somebody, answered to that, but this is actually something I would like for you guys to cover. Because oftentimes I feel like us Africans, in the name of, we want to do things our own way, whatever that means. We're rejecting things that sometimes might be universal, but are these universal? What do you guys think? Because it often comes up. We don't want to do things the same old way. Anybody, either one of you who wants to jump on this one?
So Aristote raised his hand.
Okay, Aristote, please go on. He's muted because I'm not seeing right now. There's 3 people on the screen. That, yeah. Okay, so while maybe Aristote is trying to get off of muting, does anybody want to take that question from this one was from Zindi, the one based on, is there a need to revisit the African democracy based on its dynamic currently? If you guys have nothing to say on that one, let me know, and then we can move to the next one. Do you guys have anything to say on that? Emmanuel?
Yeah. As Rejoice said, freedom is universal, and I think we should all agree on that. Freedom is absolutely universal. Which institutions can we find in order to protect and develop freedom? We can have a discussion about the various institutions. Kouakou, Donatien, Emmanuel, would you elaborate more on George's idea of African democracy? I would say that George's view of democracy was very much Swiss. It really reminds me of Switzerland. You start with the, subsidiarity. You start to solve political problems at the very bottom with your neighbors, and then in the village, in the city. And when people are not able to solve their problems in the village or in the city, then they turn to the region. And when they're not able to solve their problems at the regional level, they finally turn to the government. So the process should be like this, in a bottom up way. And George, especially in Indigenous African Institutions, another book he has, George really describes how the process of debate that you guys have in many parts of Africa. It's not all, Africa is not a monolithic place. Obviously, you have completely different traditions from region and village to another village. But the thing is that you tend to have this participatory democratic culture. You know, people, they talk together, they debate in the village and they in the city, and they try to, you know, discuss together at the lowest level possible. And I find it very Swiss, if you want, and not completely un-French. The French, everything starts with the government.
Yeah.
That's the opposite, top down.
Yeah, yeah. Good point, Emmanuel. We have Ibrahim Muawiyah, sorry. Ibrahim, do you want to go on? Just unmute yourself and please ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. Am I loud and clear?
Please, we can hear you. Yes, please go ahead.
My question goes to Emma. He's talking of how that we need to have an African middle class that engages in production. A lot of discussion has been done on the what. The real issue here is the how. Because the African middle class is the consumption middle class, as he observes. These people are working in the multinational corporations, they are working with the civil society, and they are hitting supermarkets every day. How do we get them from the supermarkets buying foreign products that are a subject of their esteem and get them into production? How do we do that? Is what I would like to hear Emma talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Emeka, do you want to take that one?
Sure. The way I look at it is it has to be organic, and it also needs to happen from the bottom up. I think part of what isn't happening enough is emphasizing those who are already producing as much as we need to. And this goes back to the original conversation around people who produce and people who are entrepreneurs. Maguette, for example, is an entrepreneur who is also a producer. She's a manufacturer. We have more and more people who are in the business of producing, processing, manufacturing, but they haven't gotten the degree of exposure and spotlight that I think is necessary. It's happening more, but it's taking a lot longer than it should. So if you go back even up 50, 60 years, we've always had people who were processing products. But how often did you see those people being discussed, not just at the national level, but at the Pan-African level? So I think it's how we sort of highlight the existing individuals, and we encourage more people to be spoken to and have them as the heroes of the hour. Anyone that looks at the history of the United States, for example, who are the heroes that they speak to? It's the Edisons, it's the Carnegies, it's the Rockefellers, it's the Fords. They don't talk about politicians who generally are just politicians for the sake of it. And even if you go back to quote unquote, however you describe it, the founding fathers, and yes, they were flawed founding fathers. Look at what these people did. So for me, it's not about saying to people produce, it's about looking at the existing producers and saying, these are the people we should be following. These are the people we need to get into politics, because they're the ones who are putting quote unquote food on the table. And between the conferences that I put together and things that a number of us like Maguette and others are speaking to, a lot of the business we've been in has been the business of highlighting producers. And it's been great for me, at least, to see over the past couple of decades, it's scary to think it's been that long, how today we see much more emphasis on the woman who might be making cosmetics in Southern Africa, or the young man who is producing products in DRC. These were conversations we were not seeing before. I think the emphasis is on creating role models out of people who are producers and making them the most important people in society. And every society has them. It's just that we didn't see them for what they were. And I think the more people understand that they are more important than anyone else, not the person who sits at a podium and reads speeches, or someone who is designing policy at some multilateral. The people who are producing are more important than every other individual. And the more we have them in every society, the more likely those societies are going to reach the critical mass that is needed to truly change the conversation. So for me, that is an approach that I'm involved in, and a number of other people are. And it's by doing, not by talking about it. And I feel the more that join that conversation, the merrier it will be in terms of bringing people in and seeing this as critical. I've had 2 blogs that I don't blog on as much. That's entirely what they speak to. And I'll leave the links in the chat section. And this is something Maggette and others have been working on. So that is one thing to look at. I'm not saying it's the only thing to look at, but I think it's really critical. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emeka. And I have to say that you have done more than your share of this, Emeka, really, truly. I mean, you've put so many people, given so many of us a stage, myself included. It's just been amazing. And almost every day, I see Emeka tweeting about someone in Africa doing something in Africa. And you've been just wonderful on that, Emeka. Thank you so much. And I totally understand the rationale behind it. Freeman Musikambesa, you raised your hand. Do you want to go for your question, please?
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. I've been following the conversation on how do we create the roadmap to African prosperity. I want to give you a very brief background. Africa, in terms of the youth, the human capital, I think it has reached that level because if we look at the statistics of the youth bulge, Africa is the most rapidly growing youth population across the world, which gives us an edge in terms of human capital as we enter into the 4th industrial revolution. Secondly, in terms of natural resource prosperity, I think the African continent does boast of lots of natural resource endowment. Hence, my question is hinged on which sphere of prosperity are we focusing upon? Do we need to effect radical shifts within the governance structure? Because in terms of human capital, we have the youngest population. In terms of natural resources, Africa has a vast array of natural resources at its disposal that can support production, as Emeka was mentioning earlier. Hence, where do we need to plug in order to ensure that the right tone of African prosperity is reached? Thank you.
Thank you, Freeman. Anyone who wanted to add something to that, or if there's a question on the chat box, but I like this type of question because we go back to action. Someone had a question for Emeka, I think it was Zimunia. Emeka, how do we join your conversations on getting the market connections done?
I just posted my Twitter handle. I also posted a link to the 2 blogs that I've published over the years. I think some of the most vibrant conversations happen on Twitter these days. I know that Asemota, Big Chief, is at this event. I'm not quite sure when he's speaking,
Tomorrow.
but some of the most incisive conversations on the approach that we could be taking in a whole range of areas, I feel, is happening on Twitter. You know, they're the books and they're the posts. And I think that's a good place to start, whether it's the blogs, Twitter, certain people who are really pushing the conversation forward. I'll think of others and include their handles. And when you go to their handles on Twitter, search for certain topics. So that would be my first response in terms of how we approach these conversations. There's no one way. It's a very complex, there's a lot of complexity tied into what we could be doing. But I think for me, the most important is to look at the people who are doing it, whether it's Maguette and what she's done in her companies, or whether it's people like Osha Gabi, who is working in the area of biotech and computing, and whether it's people who are refining, who are doing stuff with livestock. Seek out the people who are building. I'm not talking about traders necessarily. I'm talking about people who are in the business of building productive businesses. And look at what they're doing. Who are they connected to? Look, who are the people in your own local environment that are doing this kind of work? I think you'll be surprised. So those are some of my thoughts, but there are others, and I'll put them in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Emeka. I think we have a few more, we have time for a couple more questions. Anybody else had any questions right now? Yeah, this was definitely something that our professor was very big on, you know, this idea of we need to be producers, we need to manufacture, we need to, you know, transform, you know, on the ground. So he was very big on that, very big. Any other questions that people might have here? Oh, somebody's saying that his question was not answered. It's Sheikh Abdul. So let me go back, Sheikh Abdul, and try to look at your question. I think you're doing it in French. So let me see if I can translate. He's saying, if so, how to find the mechanisms? So you're looking for the, you're interested in the financing mechanisms, Sheikh Abdul. Votre question, c'était sur les mécanismes de financement, c'est ça? Vous pouvez venir sur le... Vous pouvez vous exprimer directement, comme ça on peut entendre votre question. Cheikh Abdul. I don't know if he's here. Is Cheikh Abdul here? Okay, Cheikh Abdul, if you can unmute yourself, maybe try that, because I saw you had a very long question, so I'm not sure. Yes? Cheikh Abdul, allez-y. C'était quoi votre question, s'il vous plaît?
Oui, je disais bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour. Allez-y, on vous écoute.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, on vous écoute, cher Abdul. Posez
Allô?
votre question. Allez-y, on vous entend. Posez votre question, on vous entend.
Allô, bonjour.
Oui. Cher Abdul, on vous entend. Allez-y, posez votre question, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
Oui, on vous entend. Allez-y, allez-y. Posez votre question, s'il vous plaît.
Ah, ok. Donc, bonjour. Je disais que ma question, j'avais un certain nombre de questions. C'est comment, oui, on peut trouver les mécanismes de financement du processus que le conférencier a parlé, notamment les processus de démocratisation de beaucoup de nos pays, surtout dans le cadre vers l'Ouest Afrique, notamment le Mali, le Burkina, le Tchad, tous ces pays où aujourd'hui nous parlons de transition qui est dirigée par des militaires et qui portent l'arme, t'empêche d'exprimer ce que toi tu penses, s'en prend à ta liberté. Donc, c'est ça ma question.
D'accord.
Deuxième question, j'ai demandé l'état actuel de la démocratie en Afrique,
Abdul, on peut faire
disons à la mode africaine, est plus orienté vers la répression et la peur de s'exprimer, surtout par des soi-disant présidents patriotes.
Cher
Et
Abdul,
c'est un peu le courant actuel qui est de parler d'indépendance, de souveraineté. Alors
okay.
que d'une part, ces présidents viennent au pouvoir sans avoir consulté cette population qu'elle
Cher
elle est
Abdul,
censée diriger.
mais
Et
est-ce que
deuxièmement,
Abdul nous entend?
la participation aux instances de décision de ce pouvoir
Okay,
est
Cher Abdul,
cadrée uniquement par ceux qui sont à la tête. Les citoyens ne s'expriment pas.
okay, so sorry before Sheikh Abdul, but I'm afraid that he's going into us places that maybe his question will be better for the next panel, because he's complaining, he's basically talking about, you know, right now in West Africa especially, we had a resurgence of coups, you know, Mali, Guinea, we have a few places like that where right now we have the military, the junta in place. Instead of, you know, so he's asking questions about that. I don't think it's really for this panel. Hopefully he's back and he can talk to the next panel, because that's more what they're going to talk about. So here I really wanted to keep it, you know, focused on the work of Professor Aite and how, and the roadmap to prosperity. It is 5:25. We might have one more question here. I still see Zimunia saying, okay, so I'm going to read Zimunia's question. I think modern day Africa is still framed in the 1963 Organization of African Unity think tank of Ghana. Now, can't we, I mean us libertarians, cause another such think tank to move away from politics toward economics, free trade, human capital movement in the continent? Can some think tank do that? What do you guys think? Emmanuel, go ahead.
Yep. And that's relating this to Matt's book again, the work of think tanks to make incentivize institutional changes in Africa is very important. So, and there is an private international financing of think tanks, which is very important, and that's why efforts like Atlas are very important, because they help local think tanks to push for transition, to push for institutional change, to push for reform. I just want to say one thing: the African paradox is not only that you have a wealth of riches, of natural riches. It's also the fact that nowhere in the world do you have that many entrepreneurs. Africa is a continent of entrepreneurs, but small entrepreneurs. Africa is a continent of markets, of free markets, but small free markets. Why? Because of the lack of freedom, because of the lack of economic freedom. And it would take only a very small, change, institutional change, to make a legal framework in which those entrepreneurs, tremendous entrepreneurs, could actually grow and get the financing. But because of the uncertainty of the institutional framework, of the legal framework, it's complicated to make those very, very small companies grow. And that's the role of think tank, to show the way on how to get rid of all those barriers, all those regulatory barriers that prevent entrepreneurs, African entrepreneurs, to get, bigger companies.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emmanuel. Well, I think we're getting to the end of this panel. Any parting words I would love to hear a parting word from each one of you. Emeka, what would be your parting words, and what do you want to leave us with?
I think my parting words would be that if we look around us, wherever we're from, whichever country we're in, even if you're outside your country of abode, look to people who are making things and people who are producing things. I remember when Obama was about to be sworn in 2000, was it 2008? I can't remember the exact time. One of the things I was struck on by his inaugural speech was he had inserted a paragraph which was speaking to the maker of things. And I was quite surprised by that. And it later turned out that he was working with a science and policy advisor that was involved with Make Affairs and so forth. And I was involved in co-founding Make Affair Africa in 2009. And something that was under-recognized during the Obama administration was the emphasis they placed on manufacturing throughout the United States. And here we are again under the Biden administration, where the country is reintroducing industrial policy. It's become a clarion call across developed societies that industrial policy matters. If we look at the two of the most highly valued companies in the United States, Tesla, Apple, and SpaceX, these are hardware companies. They're all manufacturing companies. So when I see this conversation about services and things that we can sort of leapfroggable, I say that we're really telling ourselves big lies. We have to understand how to produce and process. That is how we're going to have a seat at the table with everyone else, like the Japanese, like the Chinese, like the Germans, like the Brazilians, and everybody else. There isn't any other way. And however we go about doing that is something we need to figure out as we move along. So those are my parting words, and I'm interested in having conversations with people about this and finding ways in which we can move this to the top of the policy agenda. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Emeka. And I saw that you put in the chat some of your, the people that we should definitely follow on Twitter, and I love all of them. So yeah, so you guys should definitely look at these guys and follow them along with Emeka as well. Emmanuel, any parting words for us, please?
Yes, just the fact that Africa is full of entrepreneurs. They're just stifled, in they cannot express their whole creativity because of bad institutions. And those institutions need to be changed, but only Africans from civil society, from think tanks can do that, because they have the local knowledge on how to change those institutions. They have examples from all over the world, and they can, pick what's right for them, but it's not up for the others, either in Washington or Brussels or Paris, to do it for you. And that's why I encourage all the people here to join think tanks, to join the intellectual movement for freedom, because only with, as George would say, only with intellectual liberalization, intellectual freedom can you move forward in Africa and actually all around the world. Again, make sure to, for the Francophones, for the French speaking, make sure to look at the two books at the top of the chat. They're very nice, by George Aite and Matt Warner. And thanks again for inviting me. It was an honor and pleasure. Thank you, Magatte, and thank you, Emeka and the Atlas team.
Well, thank you to each of you, Emeka and Emmanuel. I really appreciate this. And I think we gotta just end it on, thank you, George, to George. Yeah, it's just a torch and we gotta carry on. We have no choice. He showed us the way, let's go for it. So thank you to all of you. Thank you.